All right, I've got this, I've titled this, thanks, Sean. I've titled this, Stop Chasing It. Stop chasing your life. And this is like, stop chasing it, and then I put a slash, and I said, go first. So stop chasing it. If you won't go first, you'll chase it. And I'll explain that in a second. But are you the type of person naturally? Because you might be a person that goes first, right? And I'll talk to you in a minute. But are you the type of person who naturally is kind of content to kind of like wait in the wings and let somebody else go first? It's a kind of a trick question because you're Canadian. And Canadians, like, percentage-wise, are late adopters. So we just want to, like, make sure that everything's working before we try it, you know? Does that make sense? Are you somebody who's content to let somebody else kind of go out and take the hit or take the criticism or expend the energy or take the responsibility? How about this? Like, when you're going to go out to eat with people and you're like, where should we go to eat? You're the one who doesn't care. Well, that's great if you're with me because I do care, and I had something in mind. But I'm just trying to, like, figure out who you are right now. You have a school group project, and it doesn't bug you if somebody else takes the lead on it, and you kind of come in, you know, as it's going, or a work assignment with a team at your job, or in your marriage. You know, like, if we asked your spouse who apologizes first, that got real. Like, who's the first to apologize, right? Or are you chasing it? Or your siblings, you know? Let's talk about the dishwasher. Now that all the married people are angry at me, let's get the teenagers angry. You're just kind of angry anyways. You're not sure why, but it's not like you pay for anything, but you're still kind of angry about it. Preach. Preach it. I teed you up, parents of teenagers. Or your friends, like when we're going to a movie, who organizes it? Who does all the texting? Well, there's somebody who goes first, you know. Something needs to be done in your world, but you kind of Homer Simpson it back into the bushes, you know, like the keep looking shocked and move slowly towards the cake, you know. Somebody needs to fill in the blank. You know, but with you, maybe it's always somebody. Like, I wish somebody would fix that. I wish somebody would do that. Pastor, I think you should. You know, but it's always somebody else, right? Somebody needs to talk to my kids about dating or sex or purity or their phones or schoolwork. You know, somebody needs to. Somebody told me that in a small group, which is another reason you need to go to a small group. They're like, well, somebody's going to. You want it to be you? And I'm like, I guess. Somebody needs to change something, right? But it's always somebody else. Or there's this part of your life where you've worked in the ability to go first, maybe in your career or maybe in your disciplines, your personal health disciplines or something. But spiritually, you're not going first. You're waiting for somebody else to go first and to do the heavy lifting, you know. Or maybe it's your career. You're just like, you're okay with everybody else going first, but maybe you need to get in there and show a little more initiative. You're just not expending the energy to get ahead of it. And so you're always kind of chasing it. You know, the first person through the wall of anything in your life or your family or whatever it looks like for you, the first person has an interesting, like there's no template for it. So it's harder up front, right? But it makes it a lot easier for the people coming behind. Does that make sense? But like the first one through the wall, have you watched Moneyball? It's one of my favorite movies. No? It's about baseball. It's a sport. But it's like the first one through the wall always gets cut up. You always get a little bloody, you know. So failure and pain are high because there's no template to follow, right? Yeah. Or maybe you just don't love pain. Any of you out there? Like, I'm not really crazy about pain or discomfort. You're not even putting your hand up because that would be uncomfortable. I want to show you today that going first costs more up front, but it costs a lot less later. And it's the right kind of bleeding, because I think what happens is we start bleeding like death by 1,000 cuts. Have you heard that? When you're constantly chasing it, you're constantly trying to Band-Aid up all the cuts, but you can't heal from 1,000 cuts at the same time, right? And there's a people out there, and there's maybe a person in you that God is calling you to go first and just take the cut up front. Bleed a bit so he can heal you, so you're not, Judges 1 says this, and I don't have much scripture today. It just says this: after the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, which tribe should go first to attack the Canaanites? So further proof that Canadians and Israelites are the same people. Because I'm just like, who should go first? If somebody wanted to go first, they'll be like, we'll go first. But nobody wanted to go first. So they're like, we got to ask the Lord, like, who do you want to go first? Because I don't want to go first. Why? Because they lost Joshua, and Joshua always went first. Made a way for the nation. He went first. The Lord answered Judah, for I have given them victory over the land. So that doesn't mean you're going to go first and dominate everything. That's not what that means. There's a plan that God has for you. But personally, I just think that there's more. I don't even like to say it like this, there's more in you. I don't think there's more in you. I think that there's more of the call of God on you. So his power, his ability. So you may not see it now. You may see talent in everybody but you. But God can make a rock talented. God can make this talented. God can speak through a donkey. So he was like, oh, you qualify. You're like, yeah. I can act like that. Donkey. You know what they say about the word assume. Were you not here Sunday? I literally preached a whole sermon about this. But, Jesus came from Judah. King David came from Judah, the first. Do we have any firstborn siblings in the house? Come on, you guys. Loud and proud. If the world falls apart, find one of these people and you might not die. The firstborns have an interesting relationship with discomfort and pain and uncertainty, because they're the first ones kind of breaking into the schools, and the first ones to play sports, first ones to get in a fight, first to struggle, first to get bullied, first to get a job. I remember coming around the school corner. It was a Christian school, so we were allowed to not super fight, but it wasn't the bubble-wrapped world, so it was real back then with real kids. And I came around the corner, and an older kid was picking on my little brother Ryan, and his name was Jonathan. And I was outraged that anybody else was picking on my brother but me. That is what are you? Oh my goodness. My dad is taking job applications, but it wasn't you. Do you guys not get humor and stuff? But I came around the corner, and I saw this guy, Jonathan, picking on my brother. And I'm like, Jonathan, stop. What are you doing? You know that I go to the same school, right? You think that I'm not going to hear about this and come and mess you up? And Jonathan had a temper, and so Jonathan, I'm like, Ryan, go in the school. I'm like, I'll see you later. I'm like, Ryan, go in the school. We always had a good relationship. I'm like, Ryan, just go in the school. And so I took care of Jonathan, and I tried to talk him down, and he was angry, and he is spin kicking stuff. That's a whole other story. He was practicing his spin kicks, and he was thinking he was pretty good, so he just spin kicked me, and I just grabbed his leg, and I'm like, Jonathan, you're not in a position to negotiate this right now. I have your leg, right? I'm just push him over backwards. I'm like, can we just stop? It's going to get embarrassing. And he just kept spin kicking, and I just kept pushing him over backwards. I'm like, dude, you got to be getting tired of that standing leg. But the first one's through. But I had nobody who did that for me, though, right? So my brother had somebody who went through it. When your first kid goes through school, it's often easier because they know they're ahead of them. Somebody's kind of broken the ground. You'll rarely hear, I think, a firstborn complain, maybe compared to the others in the family order, that life is hard because they were sort of expecting it. Don't you think so? Are you a firstborn?
Of course.
You are? Yeah, of course you are. That's why you do all the things. Did I hear that astronauts are firstborns? I feel like I heard that. That might not be verified at all. I just think, if you're in space, you don't want to be with somebody who's gravity or whatever. I don't know. I watch TV. If you want to go through first, though, pain is a non-negotiable. It's just going to be part of your life. Now, it's like this. Your life is kind of like this. I normally ask Pastor Erin. I forgot to ask her about this. But when we first got married, and she is a firstborn, but when we first got married, her situation with cars was she would drive a car until the wheels fell off. So she was totally cool with that, right? So she would just drive it until the wheels fell off. And so I think about it like this with automobiles. Once you get a little more equity and you get a little better with finances, with budget and generosity, my dad always taught me, like, better to put money in the front end than in the back end when it's going to strand you in the winter, or you're not going to be able to get to work and your boss is going to get mad because your car is always broken down. Now, if you only have limited amounts of money now, and used cars are crazy amounts of money, then maybe that's what you can afford. But to build it up to a sense where in the end, if you get like a 4 or 5 year old car, you're probably paying the same amount to drive it, where all you're doing is tires, really. Is this making sense? Than in constantly fixing everything, or being broken down and getting out of the rhythm constantly because your car is just a piece of garbage. So, and some people, because if you can work on your own cars, then Eric here can fix his whole car, so he'll buy a piece of garbage and make Nikki drive it. And but they're farm kids, you know, so like he'll just fix it and keep going. So, but that's not a skill that I have, so you know what I'm saying? Yeah. But something that you need to understand is that the car will always seem to break down in your life. It'll always seem to break down on the wrong day if you're chasing your life. And I'm not talking about your car anymore. I'm talking about you didn't take the time to get your finances on track, to bring God in with your generosity, to bring your own discipline in with budget, and maybe that's during this fasting time. Maybe you need to eat food and do that, fast spending, and actually get that together. Financial freedom is starting next week, and but I'm just saying, like, if your finances aren't in order, if you're not personally disciplined in your purity life, or in your exercise, or in your marriage, you're still working on, but you're working on too many things at once. The devil will control your timing, and it will always land when you can't afford for it to land. So if you want to die a death by 1,000 cuts and you want the easy path now, like, we don't want to fight now about this. I'm going to put it off. I'm not going to say what I really think, or I'm going to say a bunch of other stuff and distract from the real problem, which is me. I'm going to put this off, but it is going to land on you when you can least afford to pay the bill. So, but here's the trouble. Like, when you're first married, you think that life is hard. Well, first of all, when you're a teenager, you think life is hard. And it's not. It's never going to get better than that. But you're too dumb to appreciate it. And then you get your first job and you're like, oh, the earth sucks. Hold on. It's going to get worse. Then you marry somebody and you're like, I'm going to marry my best friend. And I'm like, no, you don't. You marry somebody you fight with. My best friends never argued about everything. It was like, you want to watch football? Yeah. Easy peasy. I'm married. She's my best friend sort of now. But you're not marrying somebody. You're marrying somebody you got to live with and build a life with and fight battles with, right? Then you get married, and then you're like, oh, my goodness, I'm just so tired all the time adapting to this giant baby that is a man, supposedly. I'm like, wait till you have babies and more babies, like young babies, right? It's just going to get worse. Then your kids grow up, and then you got to pay for your kids, and then you got to watch your kids, date, and the scary stuff is coming. And if you want to die a death by 1,000 cuts, it's going to start landing on you in times when this has just been our experience with life. But I think what you need to do is become like a bill, something I call like a bill picker-upper. You know what a bill is? Like when you go out to eat and you get the bill. I had a guy invite me. This is when we lived in Didsbury. I had a guy invite me for lunch. When you invite somebody to lunch, that means you're buying them lunch, right? Like, hey, I want to buy you lunch means I'm going to buy you lunch. And so he said that, and then we got there, and then the bill came, and it just sat between us for a half an hour. And I'm like, dude, you said. And he was kind of weird anyways, and I'm like, I just want to see if you're going to do this, because I thought you needed my help. You know what I'm saying? Okay, I just want to see what he would do. And that bill sat there and sat there and sat there. And that was about the last time I ever saw him. I think he'd started coming to church, and I'm like, dude, but you said, you know? But you know what I've realized since then, that's kind of an unusual situation, but I'm like, but most of the time, I'd rather just pick up the bill and pay it, because I do know that it's better to give than to receive. Yeah. And some people think it's better to receive than to give, but you don't really get it yet. Right. Yes. And see, my generosity to you buys my loyalty to you, but it doesn't buy your loyalty back. So for me, every time that I pay a bill for something, I'm becoming more loyal to you than even the bills of the church, with our family bills. Like every month we take a percentage and give it to the local church to keep the lights on and reach people with Jesus. I'm incredibly loyal here. I'll never leave. Why? Because I'm so invested. Like I can't afford to leave because I'm so invested here. My whole life is here, like it'll work out. That's why some people leave church, because they're like, well, I don't know. Like you're just dating it. That's why. You're dating it, and the bills came. Somebody had to take the trash out, and you're like, I'm out of here. I need somebody who appreciates me. I'm like, nobody appreciates that. I'm invested. I'm not leaving. Like if Aaron leaves, I'm going too. Invested. We're invested in each other, right? But pick up the bill, I'm just tired of paying for meals with you guys, so. No, you know me. That's just kind of who I am, I think. But a lifetime of chasing, think about this, creates, and I'm going to talk to the people who do go first in just a second. A lifetime of chasing creates a couple of dangerous things. It creates, you could write this down if you're taking notes, and if you're not, you could write this down. Or you're going to go home and think that you actually did something when you didn't. I would hate for that for you. Lazy brain. Lazy brain. When I would go into a job site, I was an electrician by trade, but I would run job sites. When I would come in, the guys would always say, how do you notice that small detail that's out of place? I'm like, because I was looking for it. My brain's on. Always on. If you're leading, your brain, you've got to be on. You just click a switch, and it's on, right? Not that it's got to be on all the time, but it's got to be on when you're working, Lazy brain. Sometimes you are careless because you care less. That wasn't even in my notes. I feel like that just dropped on me. You actually do care less. You care less because you expend less energy, right? I worked with a guy. He was a good number 2 on a job site. He never made a mistake, but I remember he was actually ahead of the trade from where I was. His name was Chad. Not that we name call here or make fun of Chads. Anyways, his name was Chad. He was a great number 2, but you know what? I remember it was like Wednesday, and the job super was saying, insulators are coming. You got to be out of here tomorrow, out of this floor. And I'm like, okay. I guess we're staying until it's done. And Chad's like, I'm going home at 5. And I'm like, that's why he's not running the job. That's why he was ahead of me in the trade, but behind me in the job. And then I went leaps and bounds ahead of him because I'm like, it's our job and our responsibility. He didn't care. He just didn't care enough. He'd be like, I'm not picking up the phone on the weekend. And I'm like, people need heat. It's just that sort of an idea. Something you have to learn how to do, or you got to learn to care more by expending the energy. Sometimes entitlement sneaks in there because you're used to being on the receiving end of help often, and after a while, it doesn't bother you anymore. Well, in your mind then, are you the one who receives help or are you the one who gives help? Because Jesus didn't come to get help, he came to help. So you're not going to look like Jesus, which means you're going to walk around with a low-grade guilt, and then you're going to have to come up with a reason why you're not helping people, and you're like, well, I'm hurt. I'm like, you can help hurt. In fact, that might be the only way to get healing is to help hurt. So that entitlement. You don't plan on returning the favor, or somebody blesses you, but in your mind you're like, thanks. Now, if you grew up in my home, if somebody blessed you, the first thing you did was turn around and figure out a way to bless somebody else, because you got to be like a pipeline. You can't be like the stagnant pool that it just sits in, right? It's a pipeline that God can pour more through it. So is that helping somebody think about some of this? Sometimes it's just pride. Think about this. When you're not the first to go, it's easy to sit back and be overly critical and say well, I wouldn't have done that. No, the problem is you wouldn't have done that. At all. So you can't say I wouldn't have done it that way if you wouldn't have done that. But there's no template for the people going first. So yeah, they're going to make mistakes. Nobody gets it right the first time, but you didn't get it right at all because you didn't even try it. And it takes a faith and a humility to be willing to step out and look like an idiot if it's going to smooth the way for somebody coming behind you. But you can get overly critical and proud about it. Sometimes people judge pastors, my friends and I, Pastor Aaron, they judge us and they're like, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. And I'm like, you don't really understand how this is. This is a spiritual war and there are casualties. We're trying to have the fewest of them. We can't get away with 0 casualties. It's a war. And the devil owns the planet until Jesus comes in with the church and redeems it. So we're going to lose some people. You're like, well, if they'd have treated me nicer, then I would have. I'm like, if you'd have invested, you might have stayed. But being treated nicer, salvation isn't good enough for you? Come on. You know what doesn't feel nice is hanging on a cross for somebody. When God's like, I need you to make a monumental sacrifice for your family right now. You're like, that's not very nice. God's like, or lose your teenagers, if that's what you want. There's this, what would you pay for it, And there's can be, the last thing is there can be a lack of brutal self-honesty. Because somebody else will pay if you're wrong and don't admit it. Somebody else will pick it up. Somebody else will do it. Somebody else will pay the tab. Somebody else will fix it. We can be slow to change what's not working. Slow to admit, quick to blame. You almost have the convenience of the slow bleed because somebody else will give me their blood. Wow. Like somebody else will sacrifice on a day that they're hurt when I'm hurt. But it just seems to be like a pattern. Does that make sense to you? But the first have learned how to triage things. First things first, triage things. First of your schedule to the Lord. It'll be your best year if the first of your schedule is like, okay, hold on. I'm going to go to church on Sunday mornings. First of the week. First day of the week. No, for the first Wednesday. I'm going to go, the first of my hangout time is going to be with small group. It's funny how God will allow all the other time to actually expand for you, to get in all the things that you were probably trying to get in before anyways, but just to make sure that the order's right. You get the big rocks in your life first, the first in your finances, the tithe. It's supposed to be the first, right? The 10th, right? But then as that happens, you learn to prioritize yourself. And in triage, the one thing you get out of triage is you learn to be more decisive and you become better decision makers under pressure. And some of you are like, I just fall to pieces under pressure. I'm like, well, I don't want to. The only way to get better under pressure is to be under pressure more. So you're never going to get better under pressure unless you volunteer to get under some pressure that maybe you don't even have to right now. But I'm actually going to take this on. I'm actually going to get involved in this. I'm actually going to decide up front. If I'm going to bleed, I'm going to bleed here. But the first get more courage because they need the most. Does that make sense? I think God gives courage to the first. I think God gives revelation to the first. The revelation that, look, all I have to do is obey the next thing he tells me to do. Instead of having too much time on my hands to try to overview it in my human understanding. Right. And wait until I find the perfect decision. God is not looking for the perfect decision from you. He will bless the next decision from him. And it's funny how he'll just start working out your life. And just the amount of workload goes way down when you just do the next thing that he tells you to do instead of trying to worry about all the things. You're not God, so just don't have to worry. Look, if you're facing a family situation or a house situation right now for somebody, you're facing these things. Don't worry about the whole thing. It doesn't mean don't plan, but I'm just saying don't worry about the whole thing. Do the next thing. Because what's stopping you from getting the whole thing is doing the next thing. You get overwhelmed and I can't pay off any debt. Pay off one debt. Right? Pay that off, and then you create a snowball and then the Lord starts blessing this snowball effect, But also keep in mind, too, that the devil reserves a special hatred for those who go first. So this is what we can do for those who go first in our lives. We have lots of people who go first here. Is I need to be prepared. How often do I thank them? If the devil can discourage them, he might take you down with them. So I think it's our job to thank and encourage people who go first in our lives, particularly spiritually, like your small group leaders or your team leads. Because the devil's always at the door with discouragement. Sometimes that just helps them just give the next thing and do the next thing. Sometimes what we do is we withhold honor from whom honor is due. even at work, right? Because we're like, well, I don't want them to get proud. I'm like, that's not your job. And I'll bet you that going first probably hacks their pride a lot harder than it hacks your pride to follow in their footsteps. So why don't you stop worrying about their pride and take your pride down a notch and step out first and get hurt a little bit? Then you'll start understanding like, ooh, just the challenge of their lives probably brings enough humility into them because the first fail more. The first experience. Now, to the risk takers, I want to say this to you because you might be somebody who just kind of naturally goes first. There will be an area of your life in that you might be coasting in or not even engaged in yet. So I would say like the challenge is for you as much as it is for anybody. But also I want to say this. For those of you who tend to sit back and wait, this is not for you. This is for those who tend to go first. Be careful that you're going first because God told you to. So I like climbing mountains. I'm a kind of a first person. So I like getting out there first. I hate chasing it. So even on job sites, I would always put the effort in first so that by the time the finishing came around, we had no issues whatsoever because I hated problems later. But so this is something God told me that he might be telling somebody who might go first is this. Like I like climbing mountains, right? I'll be the first one. I'm like, I'll go do that thing because nobody's doing that thing. So one time I was climbing one of those mountains and I felt like God say, when we say feeling, hearing God, it's just an impression that I had that I knew was like, oh yeah, that's God speaking to me. He said, it's great that you're climbing this mountain, but why are you climbing this mountain? And I said, because they said that I couldn't. And he's like, I don't care what they said. I didn't ask you to climb it. Then I'm like, oh, what a waste of. So if you go first, you might take on projects and take on relationships and take on things that God never asked you to. Take on businesses just because you could. And I'm like, whoa, that's not the same thing as God telling you to. God asking you like, hey, take this on. You're like, I'm going to take these other 5 things on too. And God's like, you're going to chase those things too. But you're not going to get ahead of those things, or it might distract you from, the very thing that you ought to be doing. So, but there is a call in your life to go first in some area. Come on up, worship. So say you're sorry first. Some of you should just try it. Zero laughter. All of you should just try it. Just say sorry first. Well, they're never going to. This is not about them. It's about you. Right. Somebody should forgive first. Well, they're never going to deserve it. Yeah, that's what forgiveness is. Doesn't mean you have to trust. But Jesus forgave you and you didn't deserve it and you weren't asking. You were still hammering the nails in with your sin. And he forgave you. Forgiveness comes first. Not when somebody says sorry. That's up to them. That's when forgiveness gets deposited in their account. But forgiveness is something that you have to stop drinking the poison of unforgiveness. Somebody's got to forgive first. For somebody, the breakthrough in your life has nothing to do with the breakthrough in your life. It has to do with you haven't forgiven somebody. And I don't mean forgiven pastor for preaching a great hard sermon. There's nothing to forgive about that. No, I mean like some real stuff. Get to the door and open it first. Get to small group and help with the coffee first. Get to church first. Join a small group first. You're waiting for all your friends? Well, they're waiting for you. If nobody goes first, nobody goes. Join the dream team first. Give first. Tithe first. Ask questions first. Forgive first. Believe the best about somebody first. Now, the pressure of going first pushes you to the Lord to get help more than the people that come behind you. And that is a blessed place to be in your life. But the first naturally have more authority. And if you want influence in leadership, particularly around here, get there first. Like, I hate to say it, but like Renee knows, like, nobody who strolls in late is getting promoted to do anything. I'm looking for promotability. And if you're, like, totally cool with somebody else, like, doing your job for you, I'm like, why would I give you something else that I have to do your job for too, right? Just think about it like that. Or at work. You come strolling in late and you're wondering why you don't get a raise. I'm like, that's why. It annoys bosses. Teenagers, just blow mom's mind and do the dishes. Blow her mind. Her head will explode. You can do whatever you want the rest of the day. Rest of your life, maybe. Let 2025 be the year of your first. I want to take, but keep in mind that the first The people who go first are always the first to be misunderstood. They're always the first to be criticized. They're always the first because people want to believe the worst about somebody because they're afraid of what's going to happen to them if you don't succeed. So just keep that in mind as well. It's just part of the cost of it. So, and there's somebody in your life who's already gone first. And I just want to ask you, when was the last time you thanked them? I think it needs to be a constant thing. Some of you work hard every day and you don't get thanked all that much. That's not a great feeling, but for the people who pay for you to live and eat and spiritually and at work, the people who pay for you, like they're the ones who bought the company or they own the company or they went first. Like, have you ever thanked them for it? Like, it's putting food on your kid's table. This is gratefulness. Like, thank you for going first and creating this job for me.